The child starts screaming at exactly 2:13 every night, the old housekeeper whispered without looking at Evelyn. And if you're smart, you'll pretend you never heard him. The first thing Evelyn Hart noticed about Black Hollow Estate was the silence. Not the peaceful kind that settled over sleepy neighborhoods after dark, but the heavy kind, the kind that felt alive somehow, pressing against her skin like cold fog. Even the gravel beneath the carriage wheels had sounded quieter as she arrived through the towering iron gates just after sunset. The estate sat high against the cliffs overlooking the northern forest, its dark stone walls swallowing what little moonlight managed to break through the thick blanket of clouds overhead. It looked less like a home and more like something built to survive storms people didn't talk about, or grief they couldn't outrun. Evelyn tightened her grip on the strap of her worn leather satchel as she followed the housekeeper through endless hallways lined with portraits of stern-faced ancestors. Every pair of painted eyes seemed to follow her. Some looked proud. Others looked tired. One woman in particular, a striking blonde with silver eyes and a soft smile, made Evelyn pause for half a second before the housekeeper's sharp voice snapped her back to reality. Keep moving. Her name was Mrs. Aldrich. 60, maybe older, with silver hair pulled into such a tight knot Evelyn wondered if it hurt. She carried herself like someone who had forgotten what softness felt like years ago. You clean. You stay quiet. You don't ask questions, the older woman said briskly, her shoes clicking against the polished hardwood. Most girls don't last long here. Evelyn swallowed. Why? Mrs. Aldrich hesitated just long enough to make the air feel colder. Because serving the Alpha King isn't easy. Alpha King Rowan Ashthorne. Even back in the tiny Pennsylvania town Evelyn had grown up in, people whispered stories about him. Some said he ruled with frightening control. Others said he'd become colder after his wife died 3 years ago. No public appearances unless necessary. No celebrations. No interviews. Just silence and rumors drifting through neighboring territories like winter wind. Evelyn hadn't come here because she was brave. She came because Rent didn't care about fear. Because after losing her mother and spending years taking care of a younger brother, who never made it past 11, she had learned survival rarely gave people good options. Black Hollow paid 3 times more than any housekeeping job she could find. That mattered. Even if the place unsettled her in ways she couldn't explain. Mrs. Aldrich stopped at the end of a narrow hallway and shoved open a small door. This is your room. Tiny. Cold. Barely bigger than a walk-in closet. One narrow bed. One dresser with chipped paint. A window overlooking dark pine trees swaying violently in the wind. Dinner is downstairs at 7, Mrs. Aldrich continued. Don't wander after midnight. Evelyn frowned. Why? The woman looked at her then. Really looked at her for the first time. And something uneasy flickered across her face. Not fear exactly. More like exhaustion pretending to be discipline. Because the boy cries. Evelyn blinked. The king's son. No answer. Mrs. Aldrich simply turned and walked away. Dinner felt strange. 12 staff members sat around a long wooden table beneath dim lighting, speaking in voices barely louder than whispers. Nobody laughed. Nobody lingered. They ate quickly, eyes lowered, as if someone might punish them for being too comfortable. When Evelyn politely asked about the estate, conversation stopped entirely. Forks paused. Someone shifted uncomfortably. Then an older cook muttered under her breath, "Don't ask about upstairs." Stairs. That word followed Evelyn back to her room. Outside, rain tapped softly against the windows. Wind curled through the trees in long hollow sounds. She unpacked slowly, folded her sweaters into drawers, placed the worn photo of her mother and brother beside the bed, then climbed beneath the blankets just after 11. Sleep came slowly. The house creaked too much. Pipes hummed somewhere inside the walls. Shadows stretched strangely across the ceiling every time lightning flashed beyond the trees. She almost drifted off around 1:30. Then came the sound. A cry. Small at first. So soft she thought she imagined it. Then louder. High. Shaking. The unmistakable sound of a child trying very hard not to fall apart. Evelyn sat up instantly. Her chest tightened before she could stop it. No child cried like that unless something inside them had already broken. The sound echoed faintly through the hallway overhead. Not screaming. Not tantrums. Sadness. Deep sadness. The kind that came from fear you couldn't explain in words. She glanced at the clock beside the bed. 2:13 a.m. Exactly. The crying stopped for a moment, then came again, softer this time. A trembling voice she couldn't fully hear, like someone whispering through tears. Evelyn swung her feet onto the cold wooden floor. Mrs. Aldridge's warning repeated inside her head. Don't wander after midnight. Pretend you never heard him. But the sound came again. Fragile. Lonely. Wrong. Evelyn stood anyway. Somewhere upstairs, the Alpha King's little boy was crying in the dark. And somehow, impossibly, it sounded like he was afraid of something no one else could see. The hallway outside Evelyn's room felt colder than before, as though the house itself had noticed she was awake. For a long second, she stood frozen with one hand wrapped around the brass doorknob, listening. The crying had stopped again. Silence settled over Black Hollow like a heavy blanket, thick and uneasy, interrupted only by rain tapping softly against the tall windows somewhere farther down the corridor. Maybe she imagined it, she told herself. Maybe exhaustion had twisted ordinary sounds into something sadder. But then it came again. Quiet. Trembling. A child trying not to cry loud enough for anyone to hear. Something inside her chest tightened painfully. Her younger brother, Liam, had cried like that after their mother passed. Never loudly. Never dramatic. Just soft enough to break your heart if you were paying attention. Evelyn slipped on her sweater and eased open the bedroom door. The hallway stretched long and dim before her, lit only by antique wall sconces casting pools of soft amber light across dark wood floors. Black Hollow seemed different at night. Bigger somehow. Like the shadows were stretching farther than they should. Every creak beneath her socks made her pulse jump. Mrs. Aldridge's warning echoed again. Pretend you never heard him. Do not wander after midnight. But who ignored a crying child? Certainly not Evelyn Hart. Never her. The sound drifted faintly overhead. Stairs. She glanced toward the staircase at the end of the corridor, hesitating only a second before moving quietly forward. The house smelled faintly of cedarwood and rain. Somewhere distant, a grandfather clock ticked steadily. One step. Then another. She reached the staircase and paused. The second floor looked untouched, formal, lived in. But above that, another staircase curved upward into darkness, partially hidden behind velvet drapes. The crying came from there. Third floor. Her stomach twisted. She had only been inside the estate for less than a day. Already she was breaking rules. Smart Evelyn, she thought bitterly. Lose the best-paying job you have ever had before breakfast. But the sound came again, smaller now. Fragile. Alone. Before she could second-guess herself, she climbed. The third floor felt strangely untouched, as though time moved slower here. Dust clung to the edges of framed paintings. Long hallways disappeared into shadows. Most doors stood closed. Locked maybe. Then she noticed something strange. At the far end of the hallway, beneath a single dim wall lamp, sat a tiny pair of shoes. Child-sized. Left carelessly beside a door cracked open just an inch. The crying had stopped. Evelyn slowed her steps instinctively. Her heartbeat drummed hard against her ribs. She should turn around. She knew she should. But something about the silence now felt worse than the crying. Too quiet. Too still. Carefully she approached the door. Light spilled faintly through the opening. Warm yellow light. She hesitated, then gently pushed it wider. The room beyond looked nothing like the rest of the house. Softer somehow. Shelves lined with books. Blankets draped carelessly over a reading chair. Toy wolves scattered near the fireplace. Moonlight stretched silver across the floor from enormous windows overlooking the forest. And there, curled tightly against the edge of an oversized bed, sat a little boy no older than 6. White blonde hair messy from sleep. Pale skin. Tiny shoulders trembling beneath a blanket he clutched with both hands. He was staring toward the dark corner of the room near the windows. Not crying anymore. Just watching. Waiting. Like he expected something to appear. Evelyn swallowed. "Hey," she said softly, barely above a whisper. The boy startled violently. His wide silver eyes snapped toward her. Beautiful eyes. Familiar somehow. Too old for someone so young. Fear flickered across his face first. Then confusion. Neither of them spoke. "I am sorry," Evelyn said gently, crouching near the doorway instead of stepping closer. I heard you crying. The boy said nothing, just stared. His hands tightened around the blanket. He looked exhausted. Dark circles rested beneath his eyes. Like sleep had not visited him properly in a very long time. Evelyn lowered herself onto the floor instead of approaching, giving him space. You do not have to talk, she said quietly. I just did not want you to be alone. Somewhere downstairs, thunder rolled softly across the hills. The little boy's eyes drifted nervously toward the dark corner again, then back to her, like he was deciding something. Slowly, so slowly she almost missed it, he lifted one shaking hand and pointed toward the shadows near the window. Evelyn followed his gaze. Nothing stood there. Just moonlight. Curtains moving gently from a draft. But the fear on his face was real. Deeply real. Before we continue, if stories like this draw you in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe so you do not miss what happens next. Because in that moment, sitting on the cold floor of a palace she barely understood, Evelyn realized something terrifying. The little boy was not afraid of being alone. He was afraid of something he believed visited him every single night. The little boy did not lower his hand. He kept pointing toward the shadowed corner beside the tall windows as though something stood there waiting, something only he could see. Evelyn stayed exactly where she was, sitting cross-legged on the soft rug near the doorway, careful not to move too quickly. Children who had been frightened for too long learned to notice every little movement. Loud voices, sudden footsteps, doors opening too fast. She remembered that from Liam. After the hospital visits became frequent, even kindness had sometimes scared him. It is okay, she said softly, keeping her voice gentle enough to match the rain tapping against the windows. You do not have to tell me anything if you do not want to. The boy's silver eyes flickered toward her again. Up close he looked smaller than she expected. Too thin. Too tired. Like sleep had become something he borrowed instead of something he owned. A stuffed wolf rested beside him, worn soft with age, one ear hanging loosely by a thread. He held it tightly against his chest like armor. Outside, thunder rolled low across the distant hills. The boy flinched hard enough to make Evelyn's chest ache. Storms can sound scary, she said quietly, but sometimes they just sound louder than they really are. His gaze shifted back toward the dark corner. Then, almost too quietly to hear, he whispered something. Evelyn leaned forward slightly. I am sorry, she said gently. I did not catch that. The little boy swallowed hard. His voice came out thin and shaky, as though speaking itself took effort. She comes. Evelyn's breath caught. Who comes? He pressed closer against the headboard, fingers tightening around the stuffed wolf. The lady, he whispered. She stands there. His tiny hand trembled as he pointed again toward the shadows near the curtains. Evelyn turned slowly. Nothing. Just moonlight stretching across polished wood floors. Curtains shifting softly whenever wind pressed against the old glass windows. But children did not fear empty rooms like this. Not unless something inside them already believed the danger was real. What does she do? Evelyn asked carefully. The boy hesitated. She whistles. Something cold slipped through Evelyn's stomach. A song. He nodded once. Very small. Very serious. Mama's song. Evelyn looked back at him slowly. The fear in his face changed something. This was not imagination dressed up as nightmares. He believed this. Deeply. Painfully. The little boy looked no older than 6, but sadness sat in his expression like something much older. Something practiced. What is your name? Evelyn asked softly after a moment. He hesitated again. Eli. Of course. Eli Ashthorne. Son of Alpha King Rowan Ashthorne. The child no one downstairs dared mention for more than 2 sentences. Hi Eli, she said quietly, offering the smallest smile she could manage. I am Evelyn. He looked at her carefully, like he was deciding whether adults could still be trusted. You are new, he said. His voice sounded rusty from disuse, like someone who had spent a very long time staying quiet. Evelyn blinked in surprise. I am. They always leave. Her chest tightened. Who leaves? The maids. He looked down at the stuffed wolf. They get scared. Evelyn did not know what to say to that. Something about the way he said it hurt. Not dramatic. Not angry. Just matter of fact. Like disappointment had become routine. Like people leaving had stopped surprising him. Well, she said after a second, I cannot promise anything yet. I just got here. That earned the faintest flicker of something in his expression. Not quite a smile. More curiosity. Then suddenly footsteps echoed sharply somewhere down the hallway. Heavy. Fast. Eli froze instantly. Fear crossed his face so quickly it almost startled her. He pulled the blanket tighter around himself. The bedroom door swung open hard enough to make Evelyn jump. A tall man stepped into the room like the storm itself had followed him inside. Broad shoulders. Dark sweater. Black pants. Rain still clinging faintly to the sleeves of his coat. Silver eyes colder than winter steel landed on Evelyn immediately. For one long second nobody moved. Evelyn's stomach dropped. She did not need introductions. She knew exactly who he was. Rowan Ashthorne carried authority the way thunderstorms carried pressure. Quiet but impossible to ignore. Even standing still, he somehow made the room feel smaller. More careful. His gaze shifted once toward Eli, checking him quickly before returning to her. Controlled. Sharp. Who are you? He asked, his voice low and steady enough to make the question somehow worse. Evelyn pushed herself slowly to her feet. I am sorry, she said quickly. I heard him crying and I just wanted to make sure he was okay. Something unreadable crossed his expression. Tension. Exhaustion. Maybe irritation. It disappeared too quickly to name. You were hired to clean, he said evenly. Not wander into private rooms. The words were not cruel. Somehow that made them colder. Professional. Distant. Like walls built carefully over years. Evelyn nodded immediately. You are right. I should go. She turned slightly toward the door, embarrassment warming her face. Of course this would happen. First night on the job and she was already crossing boundaries. But before she could move, something unexpected happened. Small fingers wrapped around her sleeve. She looked down. Eli had moved closer without her noticing. He stood beside the bed now, pale and quiet, clutching the fabric of her sweater with trembling hands. Stay, he whispered. The room went completely still. Even the storm outside seemed to quiet for half a second as Eli's tiny hand tightened around Evelyn's sleeve. She looked down in surprise. His fingers trembled slightly, pale against the fabric of her sweater, but he did not let go. For a child who looked frightened of nearly everything, the gesture felt strangely brave. Rowan Ashthorne noticed too. Something unreadable flickered through his expression before disappearing behind that same impossible stillness. He looked from Eli to Evelyn and back again, as though trying to understand something that did not make sense. Eli, he said quietly, his voice softer now, calmer than before. It is late. The boy lowered his eyes immediately. Not defiant. Not upset. Just nervous. Like disappointment had become something he expected from adults. Evelyn felt it in her chest before she could stop herself. The silence stretched long enough to become uncomfortable. Then Eli whispered again, quieter this time. Please. Rowan's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He stepped farther into the room, and for the first time Evelyn noticed how tired he looked beneath all that control. Tall and intimidating, yes, but exhausted too. There were faint shadows beneath his silver eyes. The kind exhaustion carved into people when sleep stopped meaning rest. She had seen that look on hospital parents years ago. On herself after her mother died. Grief did not always scream. Sometimes it just settled into your bones and stayed there. Rowan exhaled slowly through his nose before speaking again. 5 minutes, he said finally. Then she leaves. Relief crossed Eli's face so quickly it nearly hurt to watch. Rowan gave Evelyn one measured look. 5, he repeated. Do not mistake this for permission. Then he turned and walked toward the door. Before leaving, he paused briefly. His gaze flicked once toward the dark corner near the window where Eli had been staring earlier. Something tightened in his expression. Familiarity maybe. Concern. Then it vanished. The door closed softly behind him. Evelyn released a breath she had not realized she had been holding. Eli still had not let go of her sleeve. Your dad is scary, she said quietly before she could stop herself. To her surprise, Eli gave the tiniest nod. Not offended. Just honest. A tiny almost smile touched his face for half a second before disappearing. Progress. Evelyn carefully lowered herself back onto the rug near the bed. Okay, she said softly. We have 5 minutes. Eli climbed back onto the mattress and tucked his knees close to his chest. The stuffed wolf rested in his lap now. Up close, Evelyn could see stitches where someone had repaired it many times. Love things always looked a little broken. Does she come every night? She asked gently after a moment. Eli nodded once. At the same time. 2:13. Another nod. And she whistles? His fingers tightened around the stuffed wolf. Mama's song. Evelyn hesitated. Your mom used to sing to you? The room changed somehow after that question. Smaller. Sadder. Eli looked toward the huge windows again, moonlight washing softly across his pale face. Before. One word. Quiet enough to nearly disappear. Before. Before she was gone. Before everything changed. Evelyn knew enough grief to recognize it when she heard it. Do you remember the song? She asked softly. Eli hesitated. Then, barely above a whisper, he hummed something. Simple. Soft. Sad in the way lullabies often were. Just a few notes. But something about it made Evelyn's chest ache unexpectedly. Familiar somehow, though she could not explain why. Maybe because every sad song reminded people of someone. That sounds nice, she said quietly. Eli shrugged slightly. Mama sang it when storms came. Thunder rumbled softly outside again as if on cue. Neither of them spoke for a moment. Then Eli surprised her. You are not scared. Evelyn blinked. Of what? He glanced again toward the dark corner. The lady. She looked there too. Still nothing except shifting curtains and darkness. Maybe because I have not met her, she said gently. Sometimes scary things feel smaller when somebody sits with you. Eli considered that carefully. Then, after a long pause, he scooted a little farther beneath the blankets and quietly lifted one side. Not an invitation exactly. More instinct. Child logic. Stay close. Stay safe. Evelyn almost laughed softly at how serious he looked. I think your dad would fire me immediately if I climbed into the royal bed, she whispered. That earned another tiny flicker of amusement from him. Barely there. But real. The clock somewhere down the hallway ticked quietly. Minutes slipped by. Eli's shoulders slowly relaxed. His breathing steadied. For the first time since she entered, he looked less frightened. Less alone. Then came a knock at the door. Soft this time. Measured. Rowan stepped inside again. His gaze moved instantly to Eli. Awake. Calm. Quiet. Something unreadable crossed his face again. Surprise maybe. Because clearly this was not normal. Time, Rowan said quietly. Evelyn stood slowly. Right. She turned toward Eli. Try to sleep, okay? For one awful second, fear returned to his face. Quick and sharp. Like he already expected the room to become scary again the moment she left. Then, in a voice barely louder than breathing, Eli asked the question that stopped her cold. Will you come back tomorrow? The question landed harder than Evelyn expected. Something about the way Eli asked it, quiet, careful, almost bracing himself for disappointment, made her chest tighten painfully. Will you come back tomorrow? Not can you. Not do you want to. Like he had already learned that adults left, and promises were dangerous things to believe. Evelyn glanced toward Rowan instinctively. The Alpha King stood near the doorway, tall and unreadable, one hand resting loosely against the dark wooden frame. He had not interrupted. Had not corrected his son, but something in his expression sharpened slightly, as though he too was waiting for her answer. Strange. Heavy. Like this mattered more than it should. Evelyn looked back at Eli. Yeah, she said softly before she could overthink it. I will come back tomorrow. The relief on his face happened so fast it almost hurt to see. Small shoulders loosened. Tiny fingers relaxed around the blanket. Not excitement exactly. More like something fragile settling into place after being loose for too long. Okay, he whispered. Rowan watched the exchange in complete silence. Evelyn stood slowly and brushed invisible lint from her sweater. Good night, Eli. The little boy hesitated before speaking again. Good night, Evelyn. Hearing him say her name somehow made the enormous room feel warmer. Rowan stepped aside so she could leave. The moment she crossed the doorway, the air shifted again. Colder somehow. More formal. She could still feel his presence beside her as the door clicked softly shut behind them. For several seconds neither of them spoke. The hallway stretched long and quiet beneath dim lights. Rain tapped steadily against distant windows. Finally, Rowan spoke without looking at her. He usually does not speak to people. Evelyn glanced sideways. He seemed lonely. The words slipped out before she could stop them. Rowan's expression did not change, but something tightened in his jaw. Lonely and afraid are not the same thing. His voice stayed calm, controlled, but there was something underneath it now. Weariness maybe, or guilt disguised as patience. Evelyn hesitated. He said he sees someone in the room. Rowan stopped walking. Slowly, deliberately, he turned toward her. His silver eyes looked impossibly sharp under the low hallway lights. What exactly did he tell you? The question felt careful. Too careful. Evelyn shifted slightly beneath the weight of his attention. He said a woman comes at night, she answered quietly. That she whistles his mother's song. For a moment Rowan did not move at all. Not even a blink. Just silence. Long enough to become uncomfortable. Then finally he looked away toward the tall windows lining the hallway. Rain slid across the glass in crooked lines. He has nightmares, Rowan said evenly. Too evenly. Like the sentence had been practiced. Children process grief differently. Maybe that should have felt convincing. But something about the way he said it unsettled her. Not because he sounded cruel. Because he sounded tired. Tired of explaining. Tired of pretending everything made sense. Maybe, Evelyn said carefully. But he looked genuinely scared. Rowan exhaled slowly through his nose. He lost his mother young. His voice lowered slightly. Since then, people have tried to help. Doctors, therapists, specialists. None of them stayed. There it was again. Stayed. The same word Eli used. Like everyone eventually left Black Hollow carrying disappointment with them. Rowan resumed walking. Evelyn followed quietly. You should focus on your responsibilities downstairs, he added after a moment. You were not hired to care for him. The words should have sounded harsh. Somehow they just sounded exhausted. Like boundaries built from too much hope falling apart. At the end of the hallway, Rowan stopped near the staircase. Still, he said after a pause. He slept calmer tonight. The admission surprised her enough that she almost missed it. Rowan's gaze stayed fixed somewhere beyond her shoulder. Not quite meeting her eyes. Thank you, he said quietly. Then he walked away before she could respond. The next morning arrived gray and cold. Black Hollow looked different in daylight. Less haunted somehow, though no less strange. Fog rolled across the cliffs outside. Pines bent under steady wind. Breakfast downstairs felt awkward in the way first days always did. Nobody talked much. Staff moved quickly, carefully, avoiding unnecessary conversation. Evelyn spent most of the morning dusting bookshelves and polishing silver trays she doubted anyone used. But people notice things, especially in quiet houses. Around 11, while folding linens near the kitchen, two maids stopped talking the second she walked into the room. One of them, a woman named Beth with nervous blue eyes, lowered her voice anyway. You were upstairs last night. Not a question. Evelyn paused. I got lost. Beth gave her a look that clearly said nobody believed that. Nobody goes upstairs, she whispered. Especially not near the nursery. Nursery. The word caught Evelyn off guard. Why? Beth hesitated, then leaned closer. Because strange things happen up there. Evelyn almost laughed at how dramatic it sounded, but Beth looked serious. Uneasy serious. Like what? She asked quietly. Beth glanced toward the doorway first. Sometimes people hear music, she whispered. Soft whistling. Always after 2 in the morning. Evelyn felt something cold settle slowly into her stomach. And Beth swallowed. The weirdest part? She lowered her voice even more. Nobody in this house remembers teaching Eli that song. The words stayed with Evelyn all afternoon. Nobody remembers teaching Eli that song. She repeated them silently while polishing silver in the dining room, while folding laundry in the East Wing, while pretending not to notice the strange way people lowered their voices whenever the Ashthorne family came up. Black Hollow was the kind of place filled with silence that meant something. Not peaceful silence. Careful silence. The kind people built around painful truths they no longer knew how to explain. By late afternoon, rain had settled into a steady drizzle outside, fog curling low across the cliffs beyond the windows. Evelyn carried fresh linens upstairs just before dinner, grateful for an excuse to move. Her thoughts kept drifting back to Eli. The way he had clung to her sleeve. The way relief softened his tiny face when she promised to return. Nobody should look that grateful for basic kindness, especially not a 6-year-old child. The third floor felt quieter during the day. Less frightening somehow, though no less strange. As she passed the hallway outside Eli's room, she noticed the door standing slightly open. She paused. Through the narrow opening she could hear something soft. Humming. Faint. Familiar. Evelyn gently knocked against the door frame. "Hey," she said quietly. Eli sat cross-legged on the rug near the fireplace, surrounded by coloring books and mismatched crayons. His stuffed wolf rested beside him like always. He looked up immediately, and something bright crossed his face before he tried very hard to hide it. "You came back," he said. Not accusing. Not surprised. Just quietly relieved. "I said I would." Evelyn stepped inside carefully. The room looked different in daylight. Warmer. Less haunted. Bookshelves lined one wall. Small toy figures rested beside framed family photos. One photograph caught her attention instantly. Rowan stood near the cliffs outside Black Hollow, younger somehow, one arm wrapped around a smiling blonde woman while a much smaller Eli sat on his shoulders laughing. The woman had silver eyes too. Gentle ones. Familiar. Evelyn realized with a small start that she had seen her portrait downstairs. "That is Mama," Eli said quietly, following her gaze. Evelyn looked back at him. "She looks kind." Eli nodded once. "She smelled like vanilla." The answer caught her off guard. So specific. So childlike. He returned to his coloring book without another word. Evelyn noticed what he had been drawing. Not superheroes. Not castles. The same thing over and over again. A tall window. A dark room. A woman-shaped figure near the curtains. No face. Just long hair and stillness. Her stomach tightened. "Eli," she said gently, lowering herself onto the rug nearby. "Can I ask you something?" He shrugged. "The lady you see," she said carefully. "Has she ever talked to you?" He shook his head quickly. "Only whistles." "And she stands by the window?" Another nod. "Every night." His fingers tightened around the crayon. "At 2:13. Exact. Immediate. Like ritual. Like certainty." Evelyn hesitated before asking the question sitting heavily in her chest. "Does she ever scare you?" Eli looked confused by the question. Truly confused. "She is sad," he said quietly. "Not scary." That stopped her cold. Last night he had looked terrified. But now? His expression softened slightly when he spoke about the woman. "Sad. Not dangerous. Sad." "Then why do you cry?" she asked softly. Eli lowered his eyes to the paper. Quiet stretched between them long enough for rain to tap softly against the windows. Finally he whispered, "Because Daddy gets mad." Evelyn blinked. "Mad?" Eli nodded once. "He says nobody is there." He swallowed hard. "But she keeps coming." Something uneasy moved through her chest. This was bigger than nightmares. Bigger than imagination. A child repeating the same story every night at the same exact time did not feel random. Especially not when other people whispered about hearing the whistling too. A soft knock interrupted the moment. Evelyn looked up. Rowan stood in the doorway. Dark sweater. Silver eyes unreadable as always. Though this time, something about his expression shifted when he saw Eli sitting calmly on the floor instead of hiding in bed. "Dinner," Rowan said quietly. Eli looked toward Evelyn first. Not his father. Her. Like waiting to see what happened next. Rowan noticed that too. Of course he did. Nothing about him suggested he missed details. "You can join us," he said suddenly. Evelyn blinked. "I am sorry?" "Dinner," he repeated evenly. Eli eats better when someone distracts him. Not exactly an invitation. More like reluctant practicality. But still. Something softened briefly in Eli's face. Hope again. Tiny and fragile. Okay, Evelyn said carefully. Rowan gave a short nod and disappeared down the hallway. 10 minutes later, Evelyn found herself sitting at a dining table large enough for 20 people while only 3 seats were occupied. Rain streaked softly across tall windows overlooking dark woods. Silverware gleamed beneath candlelight. The silence felt impossibly formal. Eli sat beside her instead of beside his father. Another detail Rowan definitely noticed. Dinner passed quietly at first. Rowan barely touched his food. Eli pushed vegetables around his plate until Evelyn quietly convinced him to try 2 bites in exchange for dessert. To her surprise, he listened. Halfway through the meal, Eli suddenly froze. Completely still. His fork slipped quietly against the plate. His eyes moved slowly toward the enormous windows at the far end of the dining room. The color drained from his face. She is here, he whispered. Evelyn felt the room change before she even turned toward the windows. Eli had gone completely still beside her, every bit of warmth disappearing from his small face. His fingers tightened around the edge of the tablecloth hard enough to wrinkle the fabric. Across from them, Rowan's expression sharpened instantly. Not confused. Not surprised. Familiar. Like he had seen this exact moment too many times before. Eli, Rowan said quietly, setting his fork down with careful control. Look at me. But the little boy did not move. His silver eyes stayed fixed on the dark glass at the far end of the dining room where rain slid slowly across towering windows. Outside, fog drifted between pine trees like pale smoke beneath the evening sky. Nothing stood there. Nothing Evelyn could see anyway. Still, something about Eli's expression made her stomach tighten. Fear, yes. But sadness too. The kind that hurt more because it felt personal. She is standing there. Eli whispered again, voice shaking slightly. By the trees. Rowan's jaw tightened. Nobody is there. The words came too fast this time. Too practiced. Like repetition had worn patience thin. Eli lowered his head immediately. Small shoulders curling inward. The reaction hit Evelyn harder than she expected. Not fear of punishment exactly. More like disappointment. Like he had learned that saying the wrong thing made people stop listening. Hey, Evelyn said softly, turning slightly toward him. Can you tell me what you see? Rowan looked at her immediately. Sharp. Controlled. But he did not interrupt. Eli swallowed hard. She is wearing white, he whispered. Her hair moves in the wind. His breathing quickened. She is sad. The room grew quieter somehow. Rain tapping gently against glass suddenly sounded too loud. Evelyn glanced toward the windows again. Nothing. Just fog and dark trees swaying under the storm. But Eli's voice did not sound imaginary. It sounded certain. Children invented monsters all the time. Yet this did not feel like monsters. Monsters frighten children. This made him sad. What is she doing? Evelyn asked carefully. Eli hesitated. Whistling. Her stomach dropped. Softly at first, so faint she almost convinced herself it was imagination. She heard something. A melody. Thin. Distant. Carried strangely through the sound of rain. 3 soft notes. Then silence. Evelyn froze. No. Impossible. Maybe wind through trees. Maybe old pipes in a giant house. But then it came again. Soft. Sad. Familiar somehow. Eli's head lifted instantly. See, he whispered, voice trembling. She is here. Rowan stood so suddenly his chair shifted against the floor with a sharp scrape. Enough, he said quietly. Too quietly. The kind of voice people used when emotions sat dangerously close beneath the surface. Eli. Upstairs. The little boy flinched. But, now. Not anger exactly. Exhaustion. Fear disguised as firmness. Eli lowered his eyes and slid quietly from his chair. The untouched vegetables on his plate remained exactly where they were. He looked at Evelyn briefly before leaving. Like he wanted her to say something. Stay. Believe me. Do not leave me alone with this. The feeling hit harder than she expected. Rowan waited until Eli disappeared from the dining room before speaking again. He stayed facing the windows for a moment, shoulders rigid beneath the dark sweater. "You should not encourage this," he said finally. Evelyn blinked. "Encourage what?" Rowan turned toward her slowly. Candlelight softened nothing about him. He still carried authority like gravity itself, quiet and impossible to ignore. "The stories," he said evenly. "The questions." His silver eyes held hers now, sharp enough to make honesty feel unavoidable. "He becomes attached to people who believe him." Ouch. The sentence landed harder than she expected. "I am not trying to make things worse," Evelyn said carefully. "I just think he sounds scared." Rowan's expression shifted. "Barely. He has spent 3 years grieving someone he cannot let go of." His voice lowered slightly. "And every person who tried helping him eventually turned his grief into something dangerous." "Dangerous?" Evelyn frowned slightly. "What does that mean?" Rowan looked away toward the rain again. Long silence. "It means," he said quietly, "hope can be cruel when it comes from the wrong place." Something about the sentence felt deeply personal. Too personal. Like experience speaking. Like regret. Before Evelyn could respond, footsteps hurried into the room. Mrs. Aldridge appeared in the doorway, pale-faced and breathless. "Sir," she said quickly, hands twisting together nervously. Rowan turned immediately. "What?" "The west corridor," she said quietly. "The portrait room." Her voice lowered even further. One of the frames fell again. Rowan went completely still. Not angry. Not surprised. Just tired in a way Evelyn suddenly realized lived permanently beneath his skin. "I will handle it," he said. Mrs. Aldridge nodded quickly and disappeared again. Evelyn hesitated. "What portrait room?" Rowan reached for his coat hanging over the back of the chair. "Nothing that concerns staff." The answer came automatically. Defensive. Closed. But then he paused halfway to the door. "Look back once. Go to bed early," he said quietly. "And if Eli asks for you tonight," he hesitated. Something unfamiliar crossed his expression. Reluctance maybe. Or surrender. "Do not ignore him." Then he left. 20 minutes later, unable to sleep, Evelyn stood outside the third-floor hallway again. The house had grown quiet. Rain softened against the windows. Somewhere in the distance an old clock struck 2. Then faintly, so faintly she almost missed it, came the sound again. A soft whistle drifting through the dark hallway. And this time it sounded closer. The sound floated through the hallway so softly Evelyn almost convinced herself she imagined it. 3 slow notes. Familiar somehow. Sad in a way that made her chest ache before she even understood why. She stood completely still outside the third-floor staircase, one hand resting against the cold wooden railing, while the house breathed around her in quiet creaks and distant wind. The whistle came again. Not downstairs. Not outside. Closer. Somewhere on this floor. Her pulse quickened. The old clock downstairs chimed softly. 2:10. Exact. Eli had been right. Every single night. Same time. Same sound. Evelyn should have turned around. Any normal person probably would have. Go back to bed. Forget strange houses and stranger stories. But all she could picture was Eli's face at dinner. The way fear settled into him like something familiar. The way nobody seemed willing to listen. Quietly she stepped forward. The hallway stretched dark and narrow beneath dim sconces. Shadows shifted softly against antique wallpaper. Somewhere farther ahead, a draft stirred loose curtains near the windows. The whistle floated through again. Faint. Leading. Her stomach tightened. "Hello?" she called softly before immediately regretting it. Silence answered. Then another note. Slightly farther away. Like whoever made the sound had moved. Evelyn followed before she could second-guess herself. The sound led her past rooms she had never noticed before. Closed doors. Portraits covered in dust. A long hallway ending near the west wing where staff rarely went. The portrait room. Mrs. Aldridge's words drifted back to her. One of the frames fell again. Again. The word bothered her more now. Like it had happened before. More than once. The door stood slightly open. Warm light spilled faintly across the floor from somewhere inside. Evelyn hesitated only a second before pushing gently against the wood. The room beyond stole her breath. Portraits lined every wall from floor to ceiling. Generations of the Ashthorne family staring back in gilded frames. Kings, queens, children frozen forever in oil and gold. Firelight flickered softly inside the massive room, though nobody seemed to be there. At first glance anyway. Then she saw him. Rowan stood near the far wall with his back to her, shoulders tense beneath a dark sweater. One portrait rested crooked beside him, its glass cracked across one corner. He had not noticed her yet. Or maybe he had and simply chose not to acknowledge it. The whistle came again. Soft, distant, but inside the room this time. Evelyn turned slowly. "Did you hear that?" she asked quietly before she could stop herself. Rowan went still. Not startled. Just tired. Deeply tired. He stared at the portrait in front of him for a long moment before speaking. "You should not be here." The answer felt too careful. Too practiced. Evelyn stepped farther inside anyway. "I heard the song," she said quietly. "The same one Eli hums." Rowan closed his eyes briefly. Just once. Like the sentence cost him energy. "It is the house," he said finally. "Old pipes. Wind." Weak answer. Even he knew it. Evelyn glanced around the room again. Then something caught her attention. One portrait hung lower than the others. The same blonde woman from Eli's photograph. Silver eyes. Soft smile. Kind face. Queen Serena. But something looked strange. The frame hung slightly crooked, and near the bottom edge, barely visible beneath candlelight, scratch marks lined the wood. Not random scratches. Repeated ones. Like someone small had touched the same place over and over again. Evelyn stepped closer instinctively, then stopped. Her breath caught. Behind the frame, almost hidden between the wall and gilded edge, something white peeked out. Paper. Folded carefully. "What is that?" she asked softly. Rowan turned sharply. "Do not touch it." Too fast. Too serious. But Evelyn had already gently pulled the paper free. A child's drawing. Crayon pressed hard enough to wrinkle the page. A tall woman standing beside a window. Long hair. White dress. Same picture Eli drew downstairs. Same shape. Same sadness somehow. But what made Evelyn's chest tighten was the writing at the bottom. Messy handwriting. Child handwriting. "Mama says do not trust the man downstairs." The room suddenly felt colder. Evelyn looked up slowly. "Rowan." His face had gone completely still. Not angry. Worse. Hollow. Like he had seen the note before. Like he knew exactly what it meant. "Evelyn," he said quietly, voice lower than before. "Give me the paper." But before she could move, another sound floated softly through the room. Whistling. Much closer now. Not distant anymore. Right outside the portrait room door. Slow. Gentle. Familiar. And for the first time since arriving at Black Hollow, Evelyn realized something terrifying. Someone else was awake in the house. The whistling stopped the moment Rowan stepped toward the door. Not fading. Not drifting away. Just gone, as though whoever had been standing outside knew they had been heard. The silence afterward felt heavier somehow. Thick enough to press against Evelyn's chest. Rain tapped softly against distant windows. Firelight shifted lazily across the portrait room walls, shadows stretching long beneath generations of painted Ashthorne faces. Rowan opened the door without hesitation. The hallway beyond stood empty. No movement. No footsteps. No sign that anyone had been there at all. But something about the stillness felt wrong now. Too perfect. Too quiet. Evelyn stayed frozen near Queen Serena's portrait, fingers still curled around the folded drawing. "Mama says do not trust the man downstairs." The sentence kept replaying in her head in Eli's uneven handwriting. Child handwriting. Honest handwriting. Rowan looked down both ends of the hallway before slowly closing the door again. When he turned back toward her, something in his face had changed. Less guarded maybe. Or simply more tired. "Give me the note," he said quietly. Not angry. Just careful. Evelyn hesitated. "Did Eli write this?" Rowan nodded once after a pause. "About a year ago." Her stomach tightened. Why would he say not to trust the man downstairs? Rowan exhaled slowly through his nose and looked away toward the fireplace. "Because grief changes memory," he said quietly. And children hear things they do not understand. Weak answer again. Too polished. Too practiced. Evelyn lowered the paper slightly. That does not sound like imagination. Rowan's silver eyes met hers instantly. Something flickered there. Hurt maybe. Or frustration buried beneath restraint. You have known him for less than 48 hours, he said evenly. Please do not assume you understand what years of specialists could not. Ouch again. But beneath the sharpness she heard something else. Fear. Real fear. Not of her. Of losing control over something he had spent years trying desperately to hold together. Evelyn softened her voice. I am not trying to challenge you. Rowan said nothing. Firelight danced faintly across the sharp angles of his face. Exhaustion sat there openly now, harder to hide this late at night. He said she whistles his mother's song, Evelyn said gently. And now I heard it too. Silence. Rowan turned toward Queen Serena's portrait slowly. His gaze lingered there longer than necessary. Serena used to whistle when she could not sleep, he said quietly after a moment. The confession came unexpectedly. Softer than anything she had heard from him yet. Mostly during storms. Outside, thunder rolled softly over the cliffs as if summoned by memory. Eli inherited her hearing, Rowan continued quietly. He notices things other people miss. He paused. Sometimes I think that makes everything harder for him. Evelyn looked again at Serena's portrait. The warm smile. The silver eyes so much like Eli's. Something about the painting bothered her now. Not the portrait itself. The frame. Slowly she stepped closer. Rowan noticed immediately. What are you doing? This frame, Evelyn said quietly. You said it keeps falling? Rowan hesitated. Sometimes. She frowned slightly. But it is heavier than the others. Carefully she touched the lower edge. The frame shifted more easily than expected. Too easily. Like something behind it had been adjusted recently. Her pulse quickened. Rowan, she said quietly. Did anyone ever check behind this? He stepped closer instantly. What do you mean? Evelyn gently lifted the lower corner of the frame, just enough to peer behind it. Her breath caught. A narrow opening hidden inside the wall. Not large. Just enough space for old wiring maybe. Or letters. Folded papers rested inside. Several of them. Rowan went completely still. No, he said quietly. No one knew about this. Evelyn carefully pulled one free. The paper had yellowed slightly with age. Handwriting flowed neatly across the page. Elegant. Familiar somehow. Rowan took one look at it and stopped breathing for half a second. Serena, he said softly. His voice sounded different now. Thinner somehow. Like grief had stepped quietly back into the room. Evelyn unfolded the letter carefully. Not private exactly. More like unfinished thoughts. The first line alone made her stomach tighten. If anything happens to me, please make sure Eli knows I never left him by choice. Rowan stepped closer. Close enough now that she could feel tension radiating off him like cold air before a storm. There are more, Evelyn whispered. Behind the portrait sat several folded letters, hidden carefully inside the wall. Hidden, not forgotten. Intentional. Someone had wanted them found someday. Rowan stared at the opening without speaking. His expression had gone distant in a way that hurt to witness. Like memory itself had reached out and grabbed him by the throat. Then suddenly footsteps. Fast. Small. Running. Both of them turned at once. The portrait room door stood partially open. Empty hallway beyond. But somewhere upstairs, far down the corridor, came the sound of a child crying. Eli.